I am so excited to pass the microphone over to Dr. Kenneth Christie. Ken is the program head and a professor with the school in our program of Human Security and Peacebuilding. Dr. Christie is a political scientist, author, editor, and international academic who has taught and conducted research at universities in the US, Singapore, South Africa, Norway, and Dubai, and has worked all around the world. He's widely published as an author and editor with 11 books to his credit, and today works on issues of human security and its links to ethnic and state formation/failure in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, as well as issues of de-radicalization, terrorism, and human rights, as well as populism and corporate social responsibility. I'm so thrilled to have Dr. Ken Christie chairing our discussion today. So with that, Ken, I'm going to pass it over to you to introduce us to our topic today.
Thanks very much, Selena, and thank you so much for helping to organize this webinar. You really do a miraculous job in putting all this stuff together, and I'm really happy to be here and work with these experts in the field. The first thing I'd like to do is acknowledge the traditional lands on which we sit. Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors and families. And it's with enormous gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and faculty and staff come together. So thank you very much for allowing us to do this, and really look forward to this presentation. So there's a slide here which shows the sort of School of Humanitarian Studies. The Master of Arts in Human Security and Peacebuilding is sponsoring this webinar, and very happy to run it, but we have many other programs, of course. We have the Master of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management. We have the Master of Arts in Disaster and Emergency Management. And we also have a Justice Studies, Masters of Arts in Justice Studies. So we're very happy to sponsor these events and to try and increase the knowledge and show what we actually do on a practical level to try and even solve some of these enormous problems that are going on in the world. And with that, the topic today, of course, is the most media-devoted topic at the moment, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the effects on vulnerable, displaced peoples. And one of the reasons I wanted to use this sort of platform is to talk about, again, after the Arab uprisings in 2010, 2011, the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa region, has continually been subject to global attention with the conflict, with the devastation, with the chaos, and what seems to be in many cases anarchy that's been wrought. There's been widespread political and social changes. These have prompted civil war, and these civil wars and conflicts have engendered major transformation, and most importantly, and most significantly, enormous humanitarian crisis, which is their focus. And one of the biggest humanitarian crises, of course, is the millions of people who have been displaced, the refugees and the migrants in the region who have left and who have settled in other countries and who have been displaced internally and externally, of course. And these conflicts have forced the refugees and the migrants to reshuffle, particularly in countries like Ukraine, in Syria and Afghanistan. So in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, there has been a massive displacement of people in a very, very short period of time throughout other Eastern European countries and within, of course, the Ukraine. And these people have been faced with a severe humanitarian crisis. So our first speaker is Dr. Hrach Gregorian. We have three panelists. We have Dr. Hrach Gregorian, Dr. Chris Kilford, and Haval Ahmad, soon to be a doctor in a few days, as he's defending his PhD thesis on Thursday. And we look forward to welcoming him to the ranks of the academy in that sense, although he already is in the academy. But I will introduce each speaker presenter one by one, just before the topic and introduce the topic. Now, Dr. Hrach Gregorian is the Hearst Senior Professorial Lecturer and Administrative Director in the Graduate Program in Ethics, Human Rights, International Communication, Peace and Conflict Resolution in the School of International Service at the American University. This is a very prestigious establishment in Washington, D.C., the School of International Service. Many diplomats come out of the school, and it's extremely prestigious. He also heads the Institute of World Affairs and is a member of the graduate faculty at Royal Roads University. He served as one of the founding program directors of the United States Institute of Peace and is a co-founder of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. He's had several decades of experience in peacebuilding, having worked in some 30 conflict zones. And Hrach is also, I think, the longest standing member of the Human Security and Peacebuilding program, in terms of he was there at the beginning, and he's still with us, amazingly, and one of the most valued people that we have at Royal Roads because of his incredible expertise. Today he's going to give a talk on, the title is Strangers in Their Own Land, Resettlement of the Displaced in Post-War Ukraine. So thanks very much for joining us, Hrach, and take it away, as I say.
Thank you, Ken. After that introduction, I hope I don't disappoint. Let me just say it's a pleasure to be with you here today. This is a tremendously important, significant topic that we're addressing, and it's one that's going to be with us for quite some time. For those of us who are a little older than probably most of the audience here, the end of the refugee crisis in Europe didn't actually end until my generation, was in middle school. I recall the last of the camps in Germany, World War II camps in Germany, and I'm talking about the camps for the displaced, were closed in the early 1960s. So we're in for the long haul as far as the refugee crisis in Ukraine and without is concerned. Last I checked, and these figures are fluid and not entirely reliable, but last I checked, there were roughly 7 million IDPs, or internally displaced people, in Ukraine, and somewhere between 3.5 and 4 million refugees outside of Ukraine, mostly in places like Poland and other East European countries. I live in Washington, D.C., and just live and work mostly in Washington, D.C., but just north of us, of course, 300 miles or so north of us, is New York City. And to get a sense of the scale of what is going on in Ukraine and the immediate environs, imagine if you took every person, 9+ million people in New York City, and moved them. Imagine that for a second, emptying out New York City. Those of you that have been in New York City and been overwhelmed by the number of people and traffic and everything else, it's a hard thing to imagine. But that's really what we're talking about, emptying out New York City, in terms of numbers at least, when we speak of both internally displaced and those that have been have migrated elsewhere as a result of the war in Ukraine. So getting 9+ million people back is a very daunting prospect. And the longer this goes on, and We have no idea how long it will go on. The longer this goes on, the less likely, historically at least, the less likely that the refugees, a good number of the refugees, will actually return to their homes. So it's going to have a substantial, this crisis is going to have a substantial demographic impact, both in Ukraine and in East Europe. And it's anyone's guess, really, truly, what this will mean in terms not only of the fortunes of the people who have been directly affected, impacted, but also of the regimes and the peoples in the contiguous countries and beyond. And as we've seen, the refugees coming from the Middle East have had profound political impacts on much of Europe, and not just in the Polands and the Hungaries and Romanias and such of the world, but also in a country such as France, as we witnessed in the rather surprising developments this past Sunday in the elections there. The outcome there, although to the relief of many Western nations, is also a cause for some concern. So the general point is that this is a sea change that's going to define, in many respects, where Europe is headed in the immediate aftermath, which is to say another 15, 20 plus years. So this is not something that's going to go away quickly. And there is a very, very important reason to remain engaged, even after some of the war fighting has subsided. And we don't, frankly, know what is the timetable for that. Well, this type of situation, at least for the displaced, and I'll just use the term displaced and not make the distinction between internally and external right now, although there are differences to be noted. The return of the displaced, historically and in Ukraine today, offers a number of significant challenges. I don't have the time to get into the particulars in any great detail, but I will say that the headlines are as follows. First and foremost, and you know, a lot of this I'm drawing on the experience which is most relevant to what's going on in Ukraine, and that, frankly, is the experience of Europe post-World War II, because it is a European country, and the war does have an impact on not only those that have been displaced from Central Asia and the Middle East and Africa, but also on Europeans, which is different, frankly, than what the response has been to the displaced from other parts of the world. And there are some interesting issues there that one could get into, but that perhaps will leave to discussion period about how Europe has embraced Ukrainians and its reaction to migrants from other regions that have been experiencing conflict. But the challenges, first and foremost, are physical security, as we note in looking at what happened to Europeans. And I'm rather than looking at social science, I often look at literature for lessons, and I'm struck by some of the writing of Primo Levi, who you may or may not know was an Italian who was imprisoned in German concentration camps, and his release and odyssey, one might say, from Germany all the way to Turin, and the kind of social psychological effects of this on him might be a good way of also thinking about the impact of migration on Ukrainians in particular, who will be returning home. But the first and foremost issue is physical security. How to ensure their physical security, what happens with the military, what happens with the gendarmerie, what happens with the police, how is security ensured within municipalities as well as in major cities and such, who manages local security early on. In the post-World War II period, there were actual local brigades and other forces that were active long before a formal police force was in place to handle security. There's also the security of the borders. What are we talking about in terms of borders? And where might the borders eventually be established as the Russian offensive expands in Donbass and Ukraine's coast? Second challenge will, of course, be the provision of goods and services, and the aid of the United Nations and other regional organizations, as well as major bilaterals, and of course, international non-governmental organizations will be critical in terms of at least the immediate post-war period in affecting the status of the vulnerable who have been displaced. An issue that isn't often talked about when we talk about the displaced, because we do talk a good deal about humanitarian concerns, is of course organized crime. This region of the world, and Ukraine in particular, has had a history of organized crime and activities by syndicates, and how to deal with those in the aftermath of war, where there are a lot of social vulnerabilities and where national security, internal security may not be well established, is a challenge that will have to be addressed in dealing with the vulnerable. Human trafficking is part and parcel of this phenomenon, and how to deal with that. And then the typical DDR stuff, disarmament, demobilization, demining, and of course, reintegration of combatants is going to be a significant issue, because this has been what plagued Europe and other post-conflict regions, and this has implications, of course, for the vulnerable populations as well. One thing that I did want to be sure to point out was that the efforts at psychological healing post-World War II, I might also add more recently in the aftermath of the Balkan Wars, have proven rather difficult. And this is an area that's going to require a good deal of attention, because once you get beyond the physical security, once you get beyond the goods and services, and once you get beyond the issues of crime and trafficking and demobilization and such, you get into the domain of what you do with regard to healing and resilience and other factors that affect populations. And the history of therapeutic approaches, let us say, has been at best mixed. And so there has to be, with 9 million people, not all will have to be treated. It's important to have several layers of treatment for healing and reconciliation for this large a number of returnees. And for those of us who look at this in a more systematic level, it's important to have a community healing efforts as a first step, and then to look at healing at a more local level, and then in the worst cases, individualized healing. The challenge with this is going to be that psychotherapeutics and healing approaches are not terribly well established in the region. And during the communist era, in fact, those types of approaches had a social stigma attached to them. And how to effectively navigate this terrain, this rather challenging terrain of healing and reconciliation, particularly reconciliation amongst Ukrainians, where families have been torn apart and such, is going to be a major long-term challenge. But I am heartened by the European experience and the level of resilience that was witnessed there. And I'm hopeful that we'll see that level of resilience as well in Ukraine, because frankly, the resources, the regional resources, are not as well developed as one would hope. And the approaches, as we've found in a lot of other post-conflict theaters of operation, have to be customized to effectively address local approaches, and not to graft on certain international approaches that may or may not be appropriate for what the needs of the people locally are. And that's going to be a very significant issue. So having said all that, and having almost run out of time, let me just say, I've skimmed the surface, but I hope I have touched on the physical and human security challenges that are going to face these people and the rest of us, by the way, because we have a responsibility. And this is going to be a long-term project, 10, 15 years on, before we begin to see more stability in the region. That, of course, also depends on the socioeconomic and political factors that are affecting the region. And those are, many of them, up in the air. So thank you for this opportunity to introduce these ideas, and I'll turn it back to you, Ken, and we'll move on.
Thanks so much, Hrach. And I think definitely you've skimmed far more than the surface. There's a lot of depth in that analysis, and especially in terms of the human security challenges we're seeing is particularly interesting. Of course, the crime dimension that is emerging and has been emerging, of course, in Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War, which affects many of these problems, and people are not paying certainly enough attention to this. And of course, the criminal dimension in Russian politics also, which is a tremendous factor in how their politics plays out in many ways. But thanks so much for a great talk. I know I benefited an enormous amount from that. Our second guest speaker is Dr. Chris Kilford. Chris is a member of the National Board of the Canadian International Council, and he's president of that local council here in Victoria. He has a PhD from Queen's University with a focus on civil-military relations in the developing world. And today he's a fellow with the Queen's Centre for International and Defence Policy. He's also a sessional instructor at the Canadian Forces College, teaching online geopolitical and history courses, and an adjunct faculty member at Royal Roads University. Now, as a senior military officer, Chris enjoyed a 36-year career in the Canadian Armed Forces. He retired in 2014. It's hard to believe you retired, Chris. You look so young and on camera here. From July 2009 until July 2010, he deployed to Canada's embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, as a deputy military attaché, and was Canada's defense attaché to Turkey with cross accreditation to Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkmenistan from July 2011 until July 2014. So a really wide range of incredible sort of career development there, and whole kind of combination of not only academic knowledge but the practical experience within these countries also. So today, Chris is going to focus on the conflict itself. He's going to look a bit at the military dimension that continues to unfold and what that will mean from going forward from a humanitarian perspective locally in Ukraine, regionally, and then globally as a spillover effect from the crisis impacts, particularly developing countries. And he's probably going to mention the EU Belarus migrant crisis, of course, as well, that's unfolding within the region. So thanks very much for being here, Chris. Really look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Ken. And I'm using one of those special Zoom youth filters. Because believe me,
I thought it was just a moisturizer. I was going to ask you,
I am getting
old.
Moisturizer. I am getting old. But thank you to Selena and you, and to be here with my co-panelists who I've not met before, and so this is a great opportunity to be here with them. And I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to launch right in and see where we go. But I have spent, as you said, time in Afghanistan and Turkey. I was in Turkey from 2011 to 2014, right as the Arab Spring was unfolding in that area, and did spend a lot of my time on the Syrian border, seeing Syrian refugees, young people, mums and kids crossing that border, and it was quite something. And as was mentioned, Syria or Turkey is home to some 4 million Syrian refugees right now. Every single day, 500 babies are born to those refugees. So you can imagine the impact that has on Turkey, which is not a rich country. So it is a bit of a strain. And of course, we saw some 1.3 million refugees head into Europe, especially into Germany, which opened its doors in 2015. But it did have repercussions throughout Europe with the rise of far-right parties. I think a lot of that has seemed to have drifted away to some degree. And certainly Germany has done a tremendous job in looking after all of the refugees that did come into that country. And I think as we talk about what's happening in Ukraine right now, we have to note the fact that this isn't something that's just happened. In fact, for Ukraine, it's been going on since 2014 with the annexation of Crimea by Russia and the fighting in the Donbass. That alone caused at least 2 million refugees and internally displaced persons. So this is not something that's just sort of happening and we're dealing with. It's been around for a bit, and we can't forget what happened in Belarus, the August 2020 elections, and Alexander Lukashenko, the president, who had been around since 1994, hanging on to power, cracking down on demonstrations in the country. And as a result, the EU responded with quite heavy sanctions. And as a result, Lukashenko threatened to flood the EU with refugees, and he did. Working hand in glove with airlines flying out of the Middle East. Many refugees were allowed to come to Belarus, and then they were literally pushed across the border into Poland, into Lithuania, and to Latvia. And this is still going on, and it was a clear example of the weaponization of refugees. And we can't also forget what happened in Afghanistan last year with the Taliban back in power. So everywhere we look, in that particular area that we're talking about, from Afghanistan to Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, even the events of the Arab Spring in Libya in 2011 and the influx of refugees there. I mean, it's been quite constant over the last decade, and it's not getting any better. And so all of this is in our minds. But certainly what we have been witnessing in Ukraine has overshadowed much of what I've said. Every single day we're waking up to horrific scenes. Bucha, for example, with the mass graves and civilians murdered by Russian troops, and engineered human catastrophes in places like Mariupol. And these atrocities are continuing, and we're seeing such things as the use of banned weapons like cluster munitions. So I think we were all surprised by Moscow's decision to invade Ukraine. And it's upset much of the broad framework that's helped keep the world relatively stable since the end of the Cold War. And we've seen all sorts of things, terms being thrown around. Vladimir Putin announcing that one reason he was going into Ukraine was to denazify Ukraine. But I'm sure everybody listening here knows that President Zelensky is Jewish. And until Vladimir Groisman left office in August 2019, he's also Jewish. Ukraine had a Jewish prime minister and president, the first time anywhere in the world that we've seen a country like this outside of Israel, with both a Jewish president and prime minister. And this is really important when we consider that Jews only comprise about 0.13% of the population of Ukraine. So the whole premise of Russia, everything they've said about the reasons for going into Ukraine, I mean, it really, really stretches the imagination. And now we're watching the refugee flows out of Ukraine into Eastern Europe. And it's a reminder that this has been going on for a decade at least. Certainly if we pick the Arab Spring as a starting point. And we're going to see more of this as conflict and for example, climate change cause all manner of issues around the world. And we know, as has been mentioned, that 5 million refugees have left Ukraine. There's 7 million people have been displaced. 90% of those that have left are women and children. The men have to stay behind. The men between sort of 18 and 60 years old are not allowed to leave because they're expected to potentially serve in the armed forces. And this has caused our largest refugee crisis since World War II. And certainly, even though we know what happened in the Yugoslav wars, what we're witnessing now is huge. Poland has stepped up. Many in Eastern Europe have, and I think this is really important. And I think if I put my military hat on, and I'm speaking from a strategic point of view, it's so important militarily for Ukraine to have a safe haven for many of their people. And why I say this is because it allows the government and the armed forces to concentrate on the fight itself and actually not have to worry about feeding and the security of those that have fled. So they're much safer. And for the morale of your troops in the front lines, to know that their mums and dads and wives and children are in some safe location, well, that helps them as well. So I'll come back to that point. And so whilst one doesn't want to see this sort of thing happening in this particular situation, if Ukraine is to, I never like using the term win because no one's winning here, as you know. But if they are to prevail in this conflict against Russia, having these safe havens in Eastern Europe is so important. But there are also much larger issues that we need to think about as we talk about what's happening in Ukraine. First of all, Russia is the world's #1 grain producer. Ukraine is the world's #5 grain producer. They will not be shipping a lot of grain to the world in 2022. And we know that there are already pressures on the food system because of COVID. And now we're watching additional stressors being piled on top. Now, we're seeing that at home here if we go to the gas pumps or into the local food stores. But I know, and I'm sure all of you out there know, if you're speaking to your friends in places like Africa, for example, the impact on the developing world is becoming almost untenable, and it's going to create more issues in the developing world as this whole conflict continues. Indeed, we're seeing countries scrambling to secure food supplies, and it's usually the rich that prevail and the poor that are left behind. So additional stressors because of this. We've also seen a number of non-aligned countries and democracies such as India and South Africa not saying very much about this conflict, not calling out Russia. Now, in the case of India, sadly, this has been the case. You can go back to the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968. India took a very neutral view of things, but you would hope that democracies around the world would put that aside
and call Russia out once and for all. It's 2022. It's not 1968. It's not 1956. But unfortunately, we're not seeing that. I think there has to be some degree of reckoning in the future with those countries that have stood aside as this whole conflict has unfolded before our eyes. I think the other aspect that we need to consider is that Russia is quite active and has been quite active since the Arab Spring. They've propped up the Assad regime in Syria. They have taken on a role in Libya, supporting General Haftar in the war against the UN government, recognized government in Tripoli. They have been an interlocutor between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And if Russia was to fail in this current endeavor in a large way, and we saw them drawing back from Syria and Libya and their role between Azerbaijan and Armenia, this then leads to a potential another layer of instability. Think of Turkey. If, for example, Russia was to leave and the fighting was to commence again, what that might mean across a number of areas, from additional refugees to economic issues to the rise of terrorism in places where vacuums are created. So there's more to this than just the fighting that we're currently seeing in, say, the eastern parts of Ukraine. And let's just talk about the Canadian response before I wrap up. You know, Canada has played a very key role throughout, as have many NATO countries and non-NATO countries like Sweden. We have been training the Ukrainian armed forces since 2015. We've had at least 200 to 300 trainers in Ukraine since then. Some 30,000 Ukrainian military personnel have passed through our training camps. And if you think, you may not think that makes a huge difference, but it's not just training people on weapons, it's been training mindsets. What we have been able to do for the Ukrainian military is to say to them that everyone has a role to play, from the soldiers to the sergeants and to the officers. Everybody has to use their initiative and think for themselves. And that is not the way that Soviet-style militaries work. And so we've taught young people to understand what the mission is, and if their commanders are killed, to carry on so they know what to do. And you may be wondering why so many Russian generals have been killed on the front line, and that is because the Soviet way is not to trust your subordinates. And so when things go wrong, the generals have to come to the front lines, and that is why Russian generals are being killed. And so the training we have had, not just the weapons, but the mindset of the military leadership, has been fundamental, I think, to what we've seen happening in Ukraine. We are sending arms, and now we're sending artillery as well. And it's surprising, actually, to see us become so involved like this, because quite frankly, it's just not us, you know, to load planes up with grenades and rocket launchers. And let's be clear, the express aim of the weapons that we are sending to Ukraine is to kill Russian military personnel. There's no getting around that. That is what we are doing. And so short of a declaration of war, well, we are very close to that. We've also placed sanctions on Russia, and we have been joined by many countries in that endeavor, and they will have an impact, perhaps not in the short term, but I think in the long term they will. I think now it's incumbent on Canada to support international efforts to hold President Putin and the leadership in Russia to account. They're guilty of war crimes. And for us, that means holding people to account and helping to support and fund those who are documenting those war crimes, so that we have that body of evidence for what comes next. And I think it's also important for us to support Poland and other countries who are housing Ukrainian refugees with financial and other assistance, and bring, as we are, as many as we can to this country. We have the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world, outside of the Ukrainian diaspora in Russia. This is incredibly important. We know that Putin has inflicted immense damage internationally and risks doing considerably more. And Russia's global reputation, such as it was, has hit rock bottom. Every foreign policy objective that Putin had from this desire to invade Ukraine has backfired. And I do wonder when a day of domestic reckoning may occur for him. It's going to take billions of dollars to rebuild Ukraine. That's the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, and the buildings. But it's going to take so much longer, of course, to help Ukrainians adjust to what's happened to them and get them home at some point so that their lives can continue. But I think at the end of the day, we're looking at a new Ukraine, a Ukraine that is going to be a part of the European Union, I suspect a part of NATO, and an integral part, if it wasn't already, an integral part of the this European rules-based international order that respects democracy, because this is where we need to go. So thank you, and I'll end on that.
Thanks so much, Chris, for that great talk. Really in depth and a kind of a reminder of the title of a recent book. I've been looking at this book by political geographers, and he talks about, how countries, the states, are so much the sort of prisoners of their own geography in many ways, and I think we're seeing some of this going on here. The Russian state feels that it has some sort of legitimate interest in securing its borders and access to seaports. But of course, you also have these questions of resources, etc., that's going on, and how these resources are distributed and how they affect the conflict. So in some ways, prisoners of geography seems quite an apt kind of way of looking at this sort of thing in a geostrategic way. And you've laid out those geostrategic, geopolitical angles extremely well. So I highly appreciate that conversation. Our third presenter today is Haval Ahmad, who is an associate faculty in the School of Humanitarian Studies. Haval teaches in the Master of Arts in Human Security and Peacebuilding program, and his research interests include de-radicalization, terrorism, counter-violent extremism, CVE, Kurdish affairs, conflict and human security in the Middle East and North Africa in the MENA region. And his current work focuses on the de-radicalization of children and youth in the post-ISIS era, which is what he's completing his PhD on. And other areas of Haval's current work include analyzing geopolitics and foreign intervention in the MENA region and the impact on stability and human security. Now, Haval has got tremendous experience coming from the Kurdish region of Syria himself. He has worked in the public education system in Canada since 2008, working directly with immigrants and refugee students and family. His work includes advocacy, needs assessment, and individual action plans to meet the settlement and integration needs. So Haval is actually here working on the ground in Canada with actually immigrant families and refugee families, etc., which is remarkable work in itself, remarkable human security work. He's also worked with the Vancouver Police Department in a crisis intervention role, working directly with victims of crimes. And since 2016, he's been actively working on different research projects that involve collaboration with researchers in Canada, the UK, and within the Middle East. We're also working on a book together, which is contracted with Roman and Littlefield for, and we're looking at the de-radicalization on a global basis. So Ahmad is a PhD candidate now in international politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales. That's one of the top universities in the United Kingdom for international politics, international relations, and he is defending his PhD on Thursday. So I know that by Thursday we will have a brand new doctor in the School of Humanitarian Studies here at Royal Roads, and a fantastic addition to the great people who work here. What he's going to be doing today is he's going to be talking about the lessons to be learned from the response to Ukrainian refugees and the sort of global refugee, and linking that with the global refugee response throughout the world. So thanks very much, Haval, for being here, and as I say, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken, and thanks, Chris and Hrach, for the very engaging and interesting contribution. I feel like I have very little to say now after listening to both of you. So thank you so much. And it's an absolute honor to be presenting on this panel with both of you and with those in attendance as well. This is a very timely topic, as we all know, and indeed it's shame that even after 60 days or 63 days that have passed, yet the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is getting worse due to lack of concrete actions, if you want to look at it that way. If I to conclude something from this crisis, it's that our current global governance system or our current global governance organizations tasked with peace and security have failed not only in Ukraine, but in Syria, in Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Afghanistan, as Chris was talking about earlier, and the list goes on. If I were to learn something from these failures, it's the need for the reconstruction of these global governance institutions. Now, they have their flaws. These global governance institutions have not been able to maintain and enforce peace and security in a manner that adheres to our global expectations. Especially if we're talking about peace and security being the primary responsibility of some of these global governance institutions. Mainly, I'm talking about the United Nations Security Council and other United Nations bodies. However, through the Ukraine refugee crisis, the structure proved to be somehow effective in the refugee response framework. And let me be clear here, I'm not talking about refugees here, but I'm talking about the refugee system or the response we have in place. The common notion that Europe cannot handle 1 million refugee and that we don't have a system to handle a refugee crisis on this scale has been proven wrong as of March 24th of this year. This was seen through Europe's largest response to a refugee crisis since World War II, as we've seen with Ukrainian refugees. Why am I saying that? Well, if we look at the response to the Syrian refugees, and the Iraqi refugees before that, and Sudanese and Eritrean refugees, and more recently the Afghan refugees. We, as an international community and global governance institutions, acted based on existing experiences, and that's why these crises, which were terrible to start with, and included atrocities after another, were further exacerbated by the uncontrolled refugee crisis. And uncontrolled refugee movements. We simply refused to think outside of the political response norm, and that was a problem. The difference with the response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis is that we actually have been able to respond differently, which to an extent helped not exacerbate the suffering of the people of Ukraine by not pushing them to take illegal border crossing avenues and use human smugglers and hit the sea with dinghies and inflatable boats, like we have seen and continue to see with refugees from the MENA region, risking their lives and the lives of their children, falling victims to human traffickers, face rape, and if they make it, then they would face a lengthy asylum process in refugee camps with added restrictions, of course. The response to the Ukrainian refugee crisis by Europe, especially led by state actors and intergovernmental organizations, demonstrated a blunt contrast to the response to Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees and refugees from the MENA region generally. The response further generated a debate in the academic sphere on whether the EU response and even the Western media response have some sort of a racist element when compared to the EU's response to the refugees from the MENA region. And let me be clear here, I'm especially talking about the official response and the media response. I'm not talking about the general public response, where Europe and Europeans generally have been very or fairly generous with their asylum process throughout the years, at least in recent history, especially in Western Europe. And beside the state response and state official, I'm also referring to the media response, which I will tell you in a bit why that is, why the media response could be very problematic. First, the European state response. especially in Eastern Europe. Some Eastern European countries have been accused of racial biases in the response to the refugee crisis. And we've heard that throughout different media outlets. Take this, for example. Upon the Syrian crisis, over 1 million Syrian refugees were in limbo. And Eastern European states, namely Poland and Hungary, stated that there was no way that they could handle 1 million refugee or the passing of 1 million refugee through their land. Logistically, that was impossible. To make it more complicated and forget about the assistance here in the first place, Hungary built a razor wire fence with Serbia to keep refugees away. Officials were caught throwing food at refugees. Tear gas was used to spread the refugees. And some far-right politicians echoed some racist statements were heavily utilized and used on social media to get a momentum. It makes me even think of at the time where the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, officially stated that his goal was to discourage refugees from crossing into Hungary, even at the cost of treating them inhumanely. These are his words. So the very same prime minister we're talking about has been welcoming Ukrainian refugees, and that's great. But that is what should have been done with other refugees as well, if we're talking about principles. The Polish response wasn't any different than the Hungarian response. In fact, as we speak, there are refugees from the MENA region who are still stuck on the border of Belarus and Poland and unable to get in. So it's not a question of whether we can manage such refugee influx, but rather it's about the political will and the way we think. We have the means and we have the moral obligation to offer safe passage to those fleeing violence and war. And here's the proof. Recently, Poland has been actually housing up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees per day. That's a lot when you look at this number, 100,000 Ukrainian refugees per day. And that is done in collaboration with the central government, local NGOs, local municipalities, and local citizens. And that's great. So there is a system that works, but which we assumed, during the time of Syrian refugees and Iraqi refugees and Sudanese before them and the Afghan refugees, we assumed the system is not going to work. But here's a proven example that it actually works, where Poland is housing up to 100,000 refugees every single day. So what's the difference between the responses here? Is it a racial bias? Is there a security concern? Is it a sense of regional obligation, perhaps? Or is it what I like to call selective sympathy? Well, I think it's all the above. The racial bias is no longer news, and officials in Hungary and Poland have clearly stated or demonstrated that in one way or another. But let's not let that define our global response to the refugee crisis, because the response generally has been positive. Those are the few, and we are the majority. Let's keep that in mind. And with a security concern, when I'm thinking about it, yes, I strongly believe that Eastern Europe did have legitimate security concerns when it comes to allowing refugees to get in. If you are familiar with the MENA region, you would know radical extremist groups, starting from Al-Shabaab to Al-Nusra Front, to Al-Sham, to ISIS. Upon the collapse of the so-called ISIS Caliphate, they were trying to get into Europe. So there was a very legitimate security concern when it came to allowing Syrian refugees to cross into Europe. Now, not to mention that the other difference here when it comes to the security concern is over 90%, as Chris mentioned, of the Ukrainian refugees are women and children, where the case was the opposite with the Syrian refugees, right? I'm not going to say 90% of women, but the vast majority of the Syrian refugees at the time were young male, right? So there was a very legitimate security concern. And that takes me to the media point where I mentioned earlier. There is a problem with the media response when the media response is a bit biased or perceived to be biased, like we've seen in the first 2 weeks, referring to Ukrainian as not refugees or referring to MENA refugees as different type of refugees, uneducated and civilized. These terms really fuel radical extremist movements in the Middle East. And it serves as a it serves as if I wanted to call it, or it actually contributes to the narrative provided by the radical extremist group to recruit further vulnerable individuals and possibly commit acts of terrorism within Europe. So the security concern was there in the first place, and I think it was valid, but really it wasn't what prevented Eastern Europe from allowing Syrian refugees to get in, or Iraqi refugees. You know, the goal of the Hungarian prime minister, as stated, was to discourage these refugees from the MENA region to come, and therefore, with no desire to utilize means to address the security concerns, to vet refugees and let them in once cleared. So there is a selective sympathy. It's also the sense of regional obligation toward our neighbors, right? That's why the response was different. The Gulf states, you know, in the Middle East are among the richest globally, right? And as far as I know, not even one Gulf state took in one Syrian family and offered them like permanent status, as far as I know, with unrestricted access to education, to health, employment, or other essential services. They took some families here and there, some individuals here and there, but with some very tough conditions and limited rights, or to almost no rights. So when we're talking about regional responsibility, why the neighboring countries of Syria or the rich Gulf states didn't actually contribute equally as much as Europe did. So there's that sense of regional obligation when it comes to the response to the Ukrainian refugees. The neighboring countries to Syria also played a worse role because they allowed refugees in, but in a selective manner, and use them as a bargaining chip with the EU, just like the case with Turkey, or when Chris talked earlier about Belarus. Weaponization of refugees became a tool, and that was a problem for Syrian refugees as well when they were being used as a bargaining chip by Turkey to whether open the gates for hundreds of thousands of refugees to cross into Greece. So there's that. And even with those refugees in camps currently in Turkey or in Jordan and neighboring states of Syria, their presence in these refugee camps are subject to some certain conditions. And they don't necessarily have unrestricted access to essential services. Eastern Europe's response to Ukrainian refugees is based on the regional ties. Connections and interest and diaspora. There's a large Ukrainian diaspora in Poland and Hungary, and it's a natural response, what we have seen. And that played a role. The existing connections and sense of regional obligation factors in, and we didn't see that in the case of the Syrian refugee and Iraqi refugees because simply they were not part of the region, and these elements did not exist in the first place. But they did exist in the Middle East, but we didn't see them happening on a large scale as we've seen them with the Ukrainian refugees response. On the contrary, we've seen refugees from the MENA region in the Middle East humiliated and deprived of some of their basic rights, deprived from public education, deprived from health services, deprived of access to other essential services. And that's why, in my opinion, we should focus on the success model of the response to the refugee, Ukrainian refugees, rather than just stay stuck in the past practices and debate why the response was different and why it was discriminatory. Eastern Europe and EU generally, and UNHCR have been able to do what was thought to be impossible, and that is to let over, if I remember the number correctly, 3,400,000 Ukrainian refugees into Poland and Hungary in the month of March only. That's massive. It has never happened as far as we can document, or as far as the literature tells us, as far as statistics tell us. And in the month of April only, I know April is not over, so far they've let close to 1,196,000 refugees in the month of April only. That's massive. So if we add the numbers from March to April, right? What is it? Close to 5 million. It has never been done. So the mechanism in place, although it wasn't intended, but it worked. So how can we capitalize on the success of refugee response system as a model in future conflicts? Because conflicts will never end. Conflicts will continue to happen. That should be the focus. And I mean, think about it. A day after the Russian invasion, there were already refugee reception centers set up on the border with Ukraine, facilitated by the Polish government. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, Europe facilitated safe passage by opening the border. This has a huge potential to eliminate the human smuggling phenomena, which has cost tens of thousands of lives and victims of rape, fraud, extortion, and you name it. Open the border for orderly crossing. Now, Ukrainians have the legal right to enter the European Union and stay up to 90 days, right? So that's why it wasn't a question on whether they could enter or not. But the practice of opening the border at the time of crisis to a large population movement seemed doable and manageable to an extent, and very helpful to the refugees, to the Ukrainian refugees. This shouldn't be the responsibility of neighboring states only, but rather should be a global community responsibility. Yes, I mean, Poland and Hungary took the big chunk of that, but it should also be a global responsibility. Canada, for example, it's not a neighboring country to Ukraine, but so far, Canada has approved more than 54,000 Ukrainians to come to Canada for up to 3 years, while these refugees decide what's the next step in their lives. That's great. Canada is not directly influenced by the war, right? And we're not neighbors to Ukraine. But if every other country does the same, it would be a great help for the Ukrainian refugees, and not only for the refugees themselves. As Chris mentioned earlier, it's a great help for those who are fighting in Ukraine, knowing that their families are being taken care of. They're safe. Lesson three is the media. You know, the media was heavily criticized for their tone and the choice of words to describe Ukrainian refugees and the way they were describing MENA refugees. These kind of biases, you know, promote the radical extremist ideology narrative, as I mentioned earlier, and can further lead vulnerable individuals to extremist groups to commit active terrorism against the West. And it's a whole different problem we're dealing with here. In the first 2 weeks of the invasion, you know, the media changed its tone after, and the language and the pressure from us, the consumers, the general public and the voters, and that was a good. So the lesson here actually utilize that power of consumer, utilize the power of the voters to change that tone. The lesson here is to hold media to very high standards when it comes to refugee crisis. And let me be clear here, generally, the media has played a very positive role in bringing refugee crisis forward. Generally speaking, it's only the few bad apples. Lesson four, in most European countries, and even here in Canada, we offered health services, kindergarten to grade 12 education, and temporary work permit to Ukrainian refugees. Anytime the conflict ends, and if these Ukrainians decide to go back to their home country, to Ukraine, they would be an active participant in the reconstruction of Ukraine, as they were given the opportunity to grow personally and professionally while they were in a third country, and their children would not be deprived of their basic right to education as well. I mean, generally speaking, Ukrainians would not have or would not end up having one generation with no education, as we have seen with Syrian and Iraqis, where the average Syrian and Iraqi child has an average of 5 to 6 years educational gap, which makes it extremely difficult for them to catch up and continue their education. So there's a whole generation right there with no education. The lesson here is that by providing unrestricted access to health and education and employment to refugees in the host country, we are not only contributing to the refugees' autonomy, but we are being proactive for the reconstruction period. Even if some of these refugees decide to not go back, decide to stay, the host country still benefits from immigration. And the refugee category is a very important category of the whole immigration process. A country like Canada needs, not wants, needs immigration to sustain the economy. So even if some of these refugees decide to stay and not go back, the host country still benefits from that. So in summary, I can sit here all day and talk about the different treatments that MENA refugees received compared to Ukrainian refugees, but that wouldn't change a thing. What needs to happen is to start the conversation and talk about the need to shift the global response to the refugee crisis in any given conflict. In my opinion, by one, establishing reception centers in neighboring countries where conflict assessment suggests a conflict is about to break. And almost in any given conflict, we have reports. Governments, they do have reports based on the risk assessment they do, like a conflict is about to break. Be proactive, establish reception centers on neighboring countries' borders. Two, open the border in the neighboring states for refugees to cross in an orderly manner. Three, other non-bordering countries like Canada should allow a certain number of refugees to come in on a temporary basis with access to services, unrestricted access to services, and facilitate their travel. This is something Canada is currently doing, facilitating the travel of these Ukrainian refugees to come to Canada. Don't let them go through human smugglers. Four, keep politicians accountable for different treatments, especially if those comments and statements are made public and bragged about. And five, provide unrestricted access to health, education, and employment. And I keep emphasizing on that because it's extremely important. Provide that unrestricted access upon arrival in a third country, whichever third country is, whether a neighboring country or not. Refugee camps do provide housing and food, but they largely deny the right to freedom of movement and most forms of basic autonomy, which a refugee is entitled to, should be entitled to. Refugees are not allowed to move freely in most UNHCR camps, and this needs to change. I think the list could go on, but I'm also aware of the time. But these are some of the lessons we can learn actually from the response to the Ukrainian refugees, because it's sad what's happening in Ukraine. But we should always look into what has been working in our global response, and specifically I'm talking about the humanitarian crisis and how we have handled it. There have been some negative aspects of the response, but generally I think the response to the refugee crisis has been tremendous and a success model that has never been established or has never been done since World War II. And I think that should be the discussion moving forward. I'll be happy to take any questions, but that's it for my time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Haval, for a very illuminating, again, an in-depth talk on what's happening and really emphasizing the need to integrate refugees and migrants into their new local economies, because that not only benefits the refugees and migrants, of course, it also benefits the host countries, because many of these refugees bring tremendous skills and experience to these countries, and to have them just sitting around a camp, or a refugee center in the middle of nowhere, is not helpful to anyone. So it's really important to see how we can integrate displaced peoples into the economy and create opportunities within the economy. And that's a tremendous boon. I know it might not be possible for every single person to participate, but to actually encourage people to get employment opportunities, to get educational opportunities, contributes to everyone at the end of the day. Now, we do have a few questions coming up in the chat box. We don't have a lot of time left we have about 20 minutes left, but we have a question for, and again, Hrach has had to leave us because he has another very important appointment at the American University in Washington, D.C. As you can imagine, Washington, D.C. is the center of many things at the moment in terms of how things are playing out. But the question is for Chris. Chris, you have made, and I'll just read this out for you, Chris. Chris, you have made reference to a degree of reckoning with those countries that have stood aside. This would appear to be very sensitive and complex. How could that play out without triggering another layer of conflict?
Well, thanks for that, Ken, and Brenda for the question as well. And Ken, you mentioned Russia being a prisoner of geography, and And I would imagine there are times when the Russians have felt that with the encroachment of NATO and whatnot, that things have been that way. But I also, and I'm sure you would agree, they're a prisoner of Putin as well, right? And we wouldn't be in this situation if Russia had developed along the lines of the democracy that we hoped that it would become. So there's this aspect as well. But on the question of, these countries like India and South Africa that have sort of sat on the sidelines and are not willing to call out Russia because, for example, they may rely on Russia for some support or for weaponry and so forth, and are maybe looking to, the post-Ukraine situation. That day of reckoning, it's very hard to say. Does it come tomorrow or in a year or in 5 years or 10 years? But some countries, in the views of let's say Washington or Brussels or London or even Ottawa, will make a note somewhere that at this particular time and with this crisis, that those countries weren't ready to help. And so it may cause countries to say, look, when you have a crisis in your country, maybe we won't be so interested in coming to help you so quickly. I mean, there's always that aspect in the geopolitical world. And Turkey is a great example, which we can actually center on because of Ukraine. I mean, Turkey has sent weapons to the Ukrainians. They have posited themselves as an interlocutor. They've held talks between the Ukrainians and the Turks. And Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu would say that, Turkey's doing the right thing. But at the same time, we know the oligarchs are tying up their yachts in Turkey, that sanctions haven't been placed on Russia. And whereas, fruits and vegetables have been cut off from Europe, Turkey is quite happy to keep selling to Russia. And so I would imagine Turkey's stock in the major capitals in the Western world is pretty low, and even though they posited themselves a certain way, I would say that Washington would take a pretty dim view of Turkey's actions overall in this particular conflict. So that day of reckoning, Brenda, is going to play itself out, but I can't put a finger on it all, as to exactly how. But people in capitals like Washington keep a little scorecard on these things, I'm pretty sure.
Thanks so much, Chris. And we have another question that you may be able to answer from your sort of military capacity. There's a question from Karen. She's talking about apparently new types of landmines are being placed. Of course, landmines, one of the most sort of lethal forms of technology that affect conflicts even when conflicts are over. If you look at, we've had students from Human Security and Peacebuilding doing demining in Colombia, for instance, years after the conflict is over because of the devastating effect of landmines on farmers and people who are growing food. Now, the question is, do you know anything about the technologies and how will demining be conducted when the conflict ends? Again, a sort of hypothetical question about what happens in the post-conflict period, but again, an indication that the conflict carries on even after any final peace agreement is signed.
So obviously we have the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines in certain countries like Russia, and I think the United States never signed up to it. So we still see the use of landmines, and as you say, there are legacy landmines scattered all over the planet that have to be dealt with. We've also seen the Russians happily tell us that they're using hypersonic weapons and so forth. It's been quite incredible, and cluster munitions as well. But then, of course, the question is, how do you deal with the mines at the end of the day? Well, if I recall, some of the training that we have provided to the Ukrainians is demining. Our engineers have been there on the ground for at least 5 to 6 years, teaching engineering skills. And this is actually a place where Canada and other countries can contribute to once this conflict does come to an end. We're not sure when that will be, but when it does, and even now, with our demining expertise that we do have, with our robotic demining equipment and so forth, you can get in there and you can do the job. But I think
I think we have to recognize that casualties occur, children get affected by this, and it just takes so long. It's so easy to put these mines down, and then so long to actually then have to deal with them. And that's the point. And this is where Canada can make a contribution.
Thanks, Chris. We have another question from M.A. Ledger, and maybe Haval would be in a better context to answer some of this. The question on mobilizing the on-the-ground support for refugee responses. Has this conflict shown whether the state, for example, Poland, regional, the European Union, or international, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees level, were most effective at refugee management and aid? And I think I know what your answer is going to be, Haval, but I'll let you say it.
Well, generally speaking, I don't think they have been very effective when it comes to management and aids. Except we're talking with the Ukrainian refugee response, that has been slightly better than the responses to different refugee crises. And the problem with that is the conditions where aid is being channeled and funneled into this refugee camp and to the host countries, and the level of corruption as well. If we're talking about the globally, not only the response to Ukraine, but here's an example. Like Canada at one point allocated $800 million to Syrian refugees in Jordan, right? I believe it was 2014, 2015. But one of the conditions that came with that by the Jordanian government was the money has to be specifically channeled through a specific charity, and that charity was owned by the king's brother, right? So the money had been managed by a select group of people or organizations. And what does that say? Well, corruption right there. So in terms of management and aid, without management and aid, these refugee camps would not exist in the first place. Let's be clear about it. Sadly, some countries actually benefit from establishing refugee camps because they know there's tons of international aid coming to the host country. You know, whether directly through UNHCR or through state donors or even private donors, right? There's a lot of money. They're impacted by large populations, like 2 or 3 million refugees in one country, like in Turkey as well. But there are also some benefits for the host country as well, whether by, and I don't want to say weaponizing is a benefit, by weaponizing the refugees for their political advancement. That's one thing, one of their benefits. But also lots of money goes into these countries, and that kind of contribute to their national economic growth in a way. The refugees work for less money. Refugee work under the table. Refugees don't require all these services that the local citizens require, so they cost less to maintain and keep them in refugee camps. So have we been very effective at the international level and UNHCR level in managing AIDS? I think until Ukraine, we were failing miserably, in my opinion. But with Ukraine response, seeing how things are working out smoothly, pretty much to an extent, I think there's potential to manage the money and aid more effectively.
Thanks. I mean, it's an interesting question, the degree of burden it's putting on receiving states in terms of how refugees and migrants affect them when they are being paid to a large extent by international organizations, and of course taking some of that money and benefiting themselves in many ways. There's a lot of corruption in that aid also, for instance, in host countries and receiving countries and where it's going, which is a problem. It's not reaching every sector of the economy, but it's certainly reaching some of the elites within the economy, and that's a serious problem that needs to be resolved. I have another question for Haval from Adam Balagay. Adam is one of our, as you know, top human security and peacebuilding students at the present. He's asking what steps should we, local, national, and international level, should we take to shift our mindsets so as to overcome the issue of selective sympathy? As you mentioned, selective sympathy is something that's going on.
That's a $1 million question. I don't know, Adam. Honestly, I don't have an answer to that. Perhaps education, it takes two generations to be educated towards global values and common global principles. Maybe that would change our mind, but nothing really would change that in modern days. I don't know if Chris has a different opinion on that, but I really don't have an answer to that. I wish I had an answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Haval, I think you very ably discussed the reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing countries like Poland and take in refugees, and then the differences we saw when the Syrians and Afghans and others came through. I think you really, yes, I mean, it's mindsets. How do you change mindsets? I think this is where Canada has a role to play, though, because we have taken in a lot of refugees from Syria. We're doing our best. We're not doing very well, though, in terms of bringing in Afghans, but we do bring in a lot of people. And we also, as you know, we're bringing in 400,000 immigrants next year. I'm an immigrant. I'm sure many of the people here are immigrants. We all belong to this nation. We're all a project. But I think this is where, Canadians actually have to play a more active role. And I'm onto my students about this all the time because I hate the use of the term middle power. We have the 9th largest economy in the world. We're one of the biggest defense and security spenders in the world. And I think we need to start taking our responsibilities a little bit more seriously. And I often look at the United Nations, which we spend money on, but you won't find too many Canadian peacekeepers out there in the world these days, and you haven't for at least 2 decades. So my point is, if anybody can make a difference around the world, it's us. And I think this is what we need to have up here. So that when we have crises, we've seen it with our military, when we've done it in Syria, you go through the ranks of our armed forces and you ask, is anybody, are you from Syria? Do you speak Arabic? Do you speak Russian or Ukrainian? And we can find those people and we can get them in and we can help. And we need to mobilize ourselves mentally for the challenges that are coming in the future. That's my view.
Wonderful. Thanks, Haval and Chris. I think we've got time for one final question, which is coming from Eleonora Viktorova. She's saying, thank you for all the work and information. My question is, what is the expected response from Canada to Russians staying in Canada on a student visa and intended to have work and future citizenship? Is there any threat on a nation base? I'm not actually sure what that means, but considering all the sanctions being imposed not only on Russian politicians, but also on sportsmen and cultural people. So I think the question is about what's going to happen to the Russians here. And probably, as we know, there's been a massive brain drain out of Russia since the conflict, because many ordinary Russians want no part of it and they want to get out, and they can't understand what Putin is doing and they want to leave themselves, which is something that's going to affect the future of Russia also. But I'm not sure if you have an answer to that.
I can go first if Chris wants to. I think for Russians in Canada, especially international students, I haven't heard or learned about a case where a Russian student in Canada as an international student has faced the challenge of having his visa or her visa or their visa revoked and sent back to Russia. I don't think Canada would take this approach unless, this individual is directly linked to the Russian regime or the oligarchs, or an active part of the Russian propaganda. But other than that, I don't think Canada would ever take an approach where selectively deport citizens on a large scale simply because of their nationality. Canada has never done that. And I don't think any European country would do that as well, simply because they have Russian nationality, especially if we're talking about international students, right? I mean, these are here to get education, and in a way, university would have a contractual obligation to keep them. Universities, in a way, don't have the right, as far as I know, to end their agreement with the student because an agreement has already been signed in advance. But again, this situation would be different if these students or individuals are part of the larger Russian propaganda machine and part of the larger Russian regime. And in terms of the sports and culture, I think like banning them from the Olympics and the World Cup, upcoming World Cup in Qatar, these are more of symbolic things by international organizations like the FIFA or the Olympic Committee, not directly imposed by state actors like Canada, for example, as far as I know.
I could jump in too here. So on the soccer front, Haval, if I was cut off from seeing our Pacific Football Club in Langford play, I'd be devastated. So I'm sure the soccer fans are devastated. But seriously though, I mean, it's such a huge issue because we know there are so many Canadians who work and live in Russia, and there are so many Russians here. And you can imagine with the sanctions that have been put in place, that just traveling back and forth between the two countries has become difficult. Accessing money is difficult. We have to think about all of those Russian immigrants that had planned to come to Canada to become citizens and have all of their paperwork under various stages of the process, and maybe thinking about how will that play out. And I think there's a lot of sympathy in Canada for a large part of the Russian population that wants absolutely no part of this, but can't protest because we know what happens to them if they try. And so if you're a student here, if you're a new immigrant, the pressures, the issues that you're seeing every day, because you know there's tremendous sympathy in our country for Ukraine and very, very little, if any, for Russia. This is facing you every single day. So, but I think people in Ottawa understand this and are sympathetic to what is happening, and sympathetic to the large amount, the greater amount of Russian people, and we'll just see how it will play out. But let's be clear. I mean, if you wanted to hop on a plane to Moscow or go home and see your mom and dad or do any of that right now, you've got to fly halfway around the world to get to where you want to go because of all the sanctions that are in place.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. That's a great way to kind of end the webinar, I think, looking at what's the immediate effect on the ground for even Russians and Ukrainians living in Canada. As we know, Canada's got a tremendous Ukrainian diaspora as well. They've settled here, for generations in Canada. So it's interesting to also see that from their perspective, and to see how Canada is reacting to that with a fairly strong response in terms of sending aid and military, etc., to Ukraine to help fight that war. So I really appreciate that perspective. Selena, do you have a final word, or how would you like to end up?
Absolutely. Just wanting to share so much gratitude for all of you for coming together today to be a part of this session. And when I say all of you, are our panelists here, those who are able to join us live, and those who are now watching the recording as well. I think this discussion was representative of what we see in our classrooms and the types of discussions we have on our campus, whether we're physically here together or virtually in these types of spaces. Mm-hmm. So for my few words, I'll just share in the chat.
Oh, you're muted, Selena.
Oh, so thanks, Ken. I'll share in the chat box. We have a webinar coming up where we're going to dive more deeply to explore the programs themselves that all of these wonderful folks teach in. So feel free to register to join us, and I'll be sure to share the recording in our follow-up communications as well. So with that, back over to you, Ken.
Yeah, and I just wanted to express a lot of gratitude to the panelists, to Hrach, to Chris, to Haval, because it's tremendous to get such a wide variety of perspective and such a wide variety of expertise on this, from the sort of micro on the ground level to macro, looking at these issues and then analyzing them. And I think this is actually one of the best panels I've been on the topic, because I've learned an incredible amount from this, you know, even though I read about it every day and I study it, try to study it in depth, but to hear these perspectives and to hear them so clearly articulated is kind of tremendous. The insights were really profound, even though we have very short spaces in which to talk about these things and to gather this knowledge. So that's incredible. And I hope, I'm sure it's going to be recorded so that people can watch it after it is recorded. So that's great. But I'd just like to thank everyone for coming, all the panelists. And I'd like to thank all the participants, everyone who's listening in from the Human Security and Peacebuilding program, to people who may be interested in taking the degree, to people who are just completely interested in what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because it is, you know, one of the most devastating conflicts of our time at the moment. And we really need to pay close attention to this, because we're not just talking about the future of Russia and the Ukraine, we're talking about the future of Europe. We're talking about how we resolve conflicts and what works and what doesn't work. And we haven't done a terribly good job, you know, of dealing with these conflicts. And there's a great article, great discussion going on by John Mearsheimer, who is one of America's top political scientists in international relations. And he also talks about how the West and how the Western alliances must take some responsibility also for what's going on, because they have not dealt with Russia very well. After the end of the Cold War, what we should have done is try to integrate Russia more fully into a Western integration system, as we did with Germany after the Second World War. We developed a Marshall Plan and we encouraged them and we built them up. Instead, we said, we won the Cold War and, you know, you lost and you're going to be punished in some ways for losing. And we repeated that mistake with Russia, the same mistake we did with Germany after the First World War. So we should have basically looked at history and said, what did we do to get Russia on our side? What did we do to help them out? Instead, we cut them loose and we allowed Putin to become the kind of egotistical monster that he is. And he is, because, you know, there's a serious problem with the way we look at Russia, and we have not dealt effectively with it in the West. So we have to look to inwards to ourselves also and see how we can rectify some of these mistakes. But a great panel, and you know, congratulations, and looking forward to Haval's defense on Thursday and celebrating with him next week when I return from Ottawa on his brand new PhD. So that's going to be excellent. And thank you all, thank you everyone for turning up. Thank you for your questions to everyone that asked, and we will look forward to the next webinar in HSPB. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
See ya.